So I read Tokyo Ghoul Re, and it was quite the experience. An experience I want to talk about. If you have watched my last Tokyo Ghoul video, then you already know the drill. I will talk about my thoughts regarding the Tokyo Ghoul Re manga, not the anime, god forbid. And yeah, basically let's find out whether or not my criticism and my praise I gave in my last video still holds up. So I'm sure I wasn't the only one who was a little confused when he first started reading Tokyo Ghoul Re, and was then suddenly introduced to this person called Heise. Is this just Kaneki with yet another different hair color, or could this be someone else entirely? When Heise first got introduced, I was rolling my eyes a bit. I've seen so many stories where characters lose their memory for a period of time, and I almost always hated it. Some stories can make it work, but most don't, and the reason should be pretty obvious. By removing a character's memories, you're also removing an essential part of what makes them them. More often than not, their past is the key to understand their motives and aspirations. Characters change and grow from their experiences, so why would you willingly set them back to factory settings unless you have a really good reason to? The good thing with Heise, however, is that he isn't just a bootleg Kaneki, or a Kaneki who lost his identity. There is this moment I really like where Tsukiyama confronts Heise about his book taste. Tsukiyama confidently asks Heise if he likes the work of Takatsuki, whom Tsukiyama knows Kaneki was a big fan of. But much to Tsukiyama's surprise and shock, Heise declines, telling him that he isn't very fond of the main characters oftentimes dying in Takatsuki's work. This made me question whether Heise can really just be boiled down to Kaneki who lost his memories, or if maybe, over the course of the last 2 years, he has become his own person, shaped by his own experiences. And really, I think the answer isn't actually that obvious. Because let's see things from Heise's perspective for a moment. Heise only knows that there is this person called Kaneki Ken inside him. Kaneki Ken used to be one of the most feared ghouls there is. And Heise knows that Kaneki's reincarnation will mean the death of himself. In the eyes of the CCG, Heise is nothing more than a tool. He has no family, he never had a childhood, and his only purpose is to massacre basically his own species for a corrupt organization that neither values nor trusts him. And on top of that, even though he has no recollection of it whatsoever, he has to deal with the burden of having a monster inside him, that according to his superiors at least, is considered one of the biggest threats to humanity. And if this monster resurfaces, even if it's just for a moment, the CCG will dispose of Heise without second thought. And his worst fear ultimately does become reality, because at the end he dies after just being alive for 2 years. Kaneki Ken comes back to life, which simultaneously leads to the death of Heise Sasaki. I mean, if anything, then Heise's life is the real tragedy of Tokyo Ghoul. Obviously, you could make an argument that Heise lives on within Kaneki, or that Heise and Kaneki are the same person anyway, but nevertheless, I feel like treating Heise as a fake, or as a Kaneki with just a slightly different hairstyle, is kind of discrediting him and the point of his character. At the end of the day, Heise existed. Whether you want to judge him as his own person, a part of Kaneki, or something entirely different, it may be debatable, but the point is that the connections and bonds Heise formed were genuine, and continue to live on even after his quote-unquote death. Or maybe it was more of a reincarnation? Well, regardless, I quite like the implementation of Heise, because he was a character who actually had his own motivations, bonds, but also fears. He wasn't just a shell of a character that got stripped of all of his attributes, but rather he was someone who had to deal with his own set of unique struggles that were exclusive to his situation. That's why it didn't really bother me that the first 50 chapters or so focused heavily on Heise, the accused, and the investigation. On that note, something that I criticized in my last video were the investigation chapters. And since the investigation take up a large part of the early chapters, I'm happy to announce that I can kind of eat my words, because I enjoyed them much more this time. After all, there has been a time skip. The Tokyo Ghoul manga ended pretty abruptly, and we don't really know what happened to our characters. Therefore, it's quite interesting to figure out what exactly changed. Again, the reason why I didn't like the previous investigation chapters was because I felt like they weren't really adding anything to the story. But this time around, you are thrown into the cold water and actually have to figure stuff out. Talking about the investigations, let's discuss the cues. Re introduces a bunch of new characters. Seriously, I thought regular Tokyo Ghoul's cast was big, but Re was just like, bet. But anyway, let's talk about the cues, since I feel like they're the most significant new characters. Except for maybe Furuta, who was a pretty cool villain, dare I say. Personally, I feel like the cues were fine. Not great, but not terrible either. At least they're distinct enough so you can recognize them. More not later. And I think they fulfill their purpose good enough, but I wasn't particularly into their character arcs. I mean, let's talk about Urie for example. He looks like your typical cool/tough guy sidekick, and frankly that's also kind of what he is. You have probably seen characters like him before. Basically, he starts off as an egoistic or seemingly egoistic dickhead who seems to be only interested in getting stronger and stronger. But as the manga progresses, he realizes that he does indeed care about his friends and wants to protect them. I mean, it's not terribly executed, but maybe you can kinda understand why I hardly saw him as a groundbreaking addition to the story. And that's how I feel about the rest of the Qs as well. Motsuki was the only one who did actually spark my interest, but unfortunately they had a pretty predictable and rushed redemption arc. Tokyo Ghoul Re, just like its predecessor, wants to emphasize the blurry line between good and evil a lot. Which is fine by me, but unfortunately it tries to achieve that by throwing dozens of trivial characters into the mix that fail to impress. I already criticized this in OG Tokyo Ghoul, but in Re it's unfortunately way worse. Maybe it was the resulting pacing issue, in the sense that backstories and whatnot felt very rushed. Maybe it was just predictable to see the 20th Uno reverse. Oh, they aren't actually that bad of a person, they're just mentally ill because of a traumatic childhood. But bottom line, I wasn't always getting it. I feel like regular Tokyo Ghoul struggled quite a bit with making every character meaningful and interesting. But because Re has even more characters, it just makes things a lot worse. There are a lot of characters who are very underdeveloped, but worst of all, they are oftentimes incredibly forgettable, which leads to yet another set of problems. Re struggles a lot with coherency. It can be very hard to figure out what exactly is going on. There are several factors that lead to this confusion. One might be the art. Although I think Tokyo Ghoul is in general very well drawn, and even has a lot of stunning panels, I found many of the battle sequences to be quite disorientating. But what I believe to be the much bigger problem than the art itself is just the sheer number of characters. Oftentimes there are several plot elements going on at once, which leads to the perspective being shifted quite often. And unfortunately, as I already stated, there are a lot of characters who are neither particularly interesting, nor do they have very unique character designs, which led to me mixing them up, forgetting them, or to describe it in one word, it just led to confusion. Not to mention that it's in general pretty frustrating to get bombarded with underdeveloped characters, because it waters down the story as a whole as well. I said it before and I will say it again. Instead of focusing on a bunch of side characters I didn't really end up caring much about anyway, I think it would have been better to use the screen time elsewhere. Thankfully, however, Kaneki got a lot of character development at least. So let's talk about that for a moment. A central concept of Tokyo Ghoul's story is the dichotomy of eating and to be eaten. And that is something that continues to follow Kaneki in Tokyo Ghoul Re. At the earlier stages of Tokyo Ghoul's story, Kaneki was more of a reactionary protagonist, someone who saw himself as a victim of his circumstances. But over the course of the story, this slowly starts to shift. And in Re especially, Kaneki starts to become more of an active participant, rather than someone who gets pushed around. The death of Heise Sasaki, who was constantly used as a tool by the people around him, gives way to a different kind of Kaneki-ken. Someone who's willing to grab his destiny by himself, but also someone who's willing to sacrifice to achieve his goals. Kaneki is given the choice once and for all, to either keep his hands clean or to fight, and he makes his choice. People die because of Kaneki. Not just ghouls and investigators, but also innocent civilians. Kaneki can no longer hide behind the mask of a victim, because he becomes the one who sets things in motion. He becomes the one who consumes, quite literally. But this is Kaneki-ken after all, and at first it's hard for him to accept that fact. If he keeps going now, does that mean that Kaneki-ken, who was empathetic, who cared about other people's lives, was a lie? But eventually he has to accept that no matter what the answer might be, the lives have already been taken, so the least he can do now is keep going. It's his obligation to not let the deaths be in vain. That is the only way to pay respect to them. And in that sense, I feel like there is something about Kaneki that is much stronger than he gives himself credit for. He is strong because, unlike so many others around him, he takes the burden of guilt. In the world of Tokyo Ghoul, where so many people have numbed themselves from the pain of guilt, in a world where people kill and say that they had no choice, where they torture and say that it's the only way, in a world where people think that because they themselves suffered, they are justified in causing suffering to others. In a world like that, there is something inherently human about Kaneki. Something that not only a lot of ghouls, but also investigators have lost over time. Does that mean Kaneki is a perfect hero, who always does the right thing, who is never egoistical, and who always makes correct decisions? Absolutely not. Kaneki can be stupid, someone who loves to drown himself in self-pity, and sometimes even a hypocrite. But there is something about him that I do respect. Nevertheless, I want to talk a little more about one of Kaneki's biggest character flaws. For the longest time, Kaneki was obsessed with the thought of dying a tragic hero. It was a toxic self-image he tried to keep up for a long time. He reminds me a bit of Shiro Emiya from Fate in that sense, who is also obsessed with the ideal of a heroic death. I briefly mentioned this in my previous video, but basically Kaneki was purposely always taking every burden on himself. He justifies it to himself as a heroic act to save others. But the thing is, he doesn't actually achieve anything by trying to fight all alone. He only satisfies his own self-image. That's also why Toka was so angry at him in one of the earlier discussions, describing Kaneki and his expression as someone with a quote-unquote shitty tragic hero face. Toka, Hinami, none of them ever asked for Kaneki to do all this. Now that doesn't mean that Kaneki wasn't in some shape or form a tragic hero, but the point is that he secretly enjoyed seeing himself as a tragic victim of an evil world. And an important lesson he learns in Re is that this is simply not the case. The notorious line of the very first Tokyo Ghoul chapter was, "If I were to write a story with me as the main protagonist, it would most certainly be a tragedy." However, in one of the last chapters of Tokyo Ghoul Re, after going through countless and countless of hardships, but also seeing the world from all kinds of different perspectives, he states the following: "No, that is not right. It would be the same for other people. He, the protagonist of a novel. She, the leading actress of a movie. All living people. Everyone is the protagonist of their own tragedy." Kaneki stops victimizing himself and accepts that he is just as flawed as all the other individuals around him. He is just a guy trying to find his way. That's why his last fight with Arima is also such a big deal. Because Hiyori was given the opportunity to actually die the perfect heroic death he always dreamed of. In this situation, it doesn't matter if he survives or not, since everyone is already saved. His objective was to buy time, which he successfully did. He can die now. But he doesn't. Instead, he comes to terms with his selfish wish to keep on living. He has no one to fight for in this moment, no one but himself. And he does. Which ironically, if you consider his overall impact on the world as a positive one, then this is actually a much more altruistic act than the heroic death he yearned for before. If he died right then and there, then he never could have changed the world the way he did. Well then, let's talk about the ending a little bit. It seems some people don't like how happy and optimistic the ending was for a story like Tokyo Ghoul, which I can half understand. Generally, I like that our characters finally got some downtime after everything that has happened. However, it did certainly feel like it was lacking a bit of build-up. In a matter of a chapter, pretty much every central conflict was resolved. The laboratory food thing isn't a stupid idea in itself. I mean, there's even a real-life counterpart to it. But it was certainly a bit odd that that concept was never introduced before, and then suddenly it solved all problems. It strikes me as a bit weird that no research regarding artificial ghoul food was mentioned before, and then out of practically nowhere it basically solves the central conflict of the story. It sure seems a little convenient. I also found it a bit strange that important characters like Amon, Akira or Eto didn't receive any closure at all, but characters I didn't even remember the names of did. Seeing these countless characters I've completely forgotten about was a little like going through your high school graduation book, where you could see dozens of people and names that seem vaguely familiar, but not enough to actually ring a bell. I think the ending could have been better executed, but all in all I still think it was fine. To sum things up, I think Tokyo Ghoul Re is good. Better than OG Tokyo Ghoul or worse? Honestly, I'm not sure. It does some things better, like the investigation chapters. It continues to do things right, like Kaneki's character development, but it falls into the same traps as its predecessor, like being overly ambitious with its sheer number of characters for example, and it struggles a lot more with story structure, coherency and pacing. But all in all, still a good read. Anyway, what do you think about Re? Let me know in the comments. Thank you for watching and goodbye.